In April 1917, Germany smuggled Vladimir Lenin out of neutral Switzerland and back into Russia with a hugely controversial week-long train journey that would change the course of history. Within 6 months of his return to St Petersburg, a violent revolution had overthrown the Russian Empire, and Lenin himself was the new head of state. Soon after that, he'd use his new powers to have the last Tsar executed and to decide that Russia would stop fighting Germany in World War I. Germany's plan to destabilise their great eastern adversary had worked beyond their wildest dreams, to the point that Lenin was getting accused of being a German spy, and all it cost them was a train ride. Lenin's dramatic return from exile is a legendary journey that becomes a founding myth for the USSR. But how did Germany even pull off the insane logistical feat of transporting the most divisive political figure of his day across half a continent during wartime? And how did such a simple play have such devastating consequences for the Romanov regime and all the other political contenders? It's a story that actually begins before the final Tsar, Nicholas II, and sees us go back up to his grandfather, Alexander II, who was crowned in the 1850s. Russians at this point were looking at Britain, where kings had lost their power, and France, where kings had lost their heads, and wondering, why do we still have to have these feudal autocrats ruling over us? When's it going to be our turn to have a real government and a new industrial economy? Paintings like this one, Barge Haulers by Ilya Repin, were not even exaggerating the plight of the Russian people. They were actually based on real scenes that belonged to everyday life and showed that the working class was sick of waiting for better living standards. One particularly impatient socialist group known as the People's Will advocated for improved working conditions and a more ceremonial monarchy so strongly that they assassinated the Tsar in 1881. And you may recognise this building, the Church of the Saviour on Spilled Blood. It was actually built on the exact site where Alexander II was killed. It's his spilled blood that's being commemorated by St Petersburg's most iconic cathedral. Now, ironically, he had actually looked the most likely monarch yet to start the drip feeding of a democracy into Russia, but after his sudden death, his son, the second to last Tsar, swore off all that progressive nonsense and swung the pendulum as far the other way as possible, seeing it as proof that the violent lower classes couldn't be trusted with anything, and doubling down on the divine right of kings to exercise absolute power. The People's Will, of course, are not big fans of this and come back for their next assassination attempt, which ends up getting foiled, and 5 of the conspirators are sentenced to death, including Alexander Ulyanov, who you can see here in a family photo alongside younger brother Vladimir Ulyanov, better known as Vladimir Lenin. Okay, there we go, we're back. Sorry, we had to do like 2 minutes on 1800s Russian oil paintings, but now I swear we're back with the juicy, famous stuff. Lenin versus the last Tsar, and German trains and accusations of foreign espionage are going to enter this story very hard, very soon. The execution of his big brother understandably rocked the 17-year-old Lenin, who up until this point had lived a fairly comfortable and apolitical middle-class life, with a family who kept their heads down and was supposedly caught completely off guard by Alexander's involvement with revolutionaries. In the narrative of most people's lives, the emotional turning points can be kind of hard to discern, but in this case it's very clear that Alexander's martyrdom lit the fuse of Lenin's political career. I mean, your brother suddenly being killed by the state, it's almost too convenient and Hollywoodish of a motivation to want to rise up and kill the state right back. And yeah, spoiler alert, Lenin will end up doing all the killing he wants in the final act. From the death of his brother onwards, Lenin gave every waking moment to studying, writing and preaching anti-monarchy and pro-worker political ideologies, especially after he discovered and embraced Marxism. And he went on to engage in all kinds of illegal activities like distributing Marxist literature and organising workers' strikes, which landed him first in prison and then in literal exile in Siberia, another too perfect archetypal plot point that would later actually be commemorated in Russian stamps, before he was able to flee to Europe in 1900. Here, in a kind of self-imposed exile in neutral Switzerland, Lenin had over a decade to lean into his rage, write his theories and proselytize his followers, until February 1917, when he learns that his strategy of waiting in the wings has paid off, and that the stage is finally set for him. Tsar Nicholas II is mismanaging World War I so badly that his entire dynasty begins to collapse under its weight. starving civilians protest in St Petersburg demanding bread, and over the course of a week it boils over into mass strikes, mass outrage, and mass mutinies, until even the military are turning on the Tsar. He's travelling back from the front to St Petersburg when his train is intercepted by rebels near Pskov, and he's forced to sign his abdication. This leaves a power vacuum which is briefly filled by a so-called provisional government, at which point Lenin is of course thinking, damn, I wanted to be the guy who ran the post-Tsar government. If only I wasn't stuck here in Zurich, that could be me. But he wasn't the only one who sniffed out an opportunity in the chaos, and he was soon contacted by a chain of shadowy intermediaries who represented a backdoor to the German Foreign Ministry. Germany was, at this point of course, also deeply entrenched in World War I, fighting against his native Russia, who was suffering badly. Millions of Russian soldiers, despite horrendous conditions and lack of equipment, had fought bravely and given their lives in the name of the war effort. Although their disastrous organisation exposed Russia's lack of complex modern systems and administration, and some soldiers got distracted by less noble goals like committing pogroms against Eastern European Jews, they had still kept the Central Powers at arm's length, which was a major pain for Germany, who would rather have Russia out of the war so they could focus on Britain and France. And that was an outcome that would also appeal to Lenin. His platform was famously peace, land, and bread. And although the fact that by peace he really ends up meaning endless horrific violence is something that we'll get to in a minute, it is true that he desperately wanted an end to World War I. Lenin saw the war as an imperial capitalist waste of time, distracting the Russian working class from starting a much more important internal civil war against their bourgeois overlords. In that sense, he was completely opposed to both the now abdicated Tsar, who believed that defense of the Orthodox Slavic Brotherhood with Serbia was God's will, and the provisional government, who weren't quite so gung-ho but still believed that giving up on the war would be humiliating for Russia's reputation. In Switzerland, Lenin had built up quite a following of revolutionaries, known as the Bolsheviks, and his reputation as both strongly anti-war and as a highly convincing, charismatic leader made him the perfect candidate to destabilize Russia in Germany's favour. Germany trying to find a way to transport his group up to St Petersburg would be risky, but of course it was a way cheaper alternative than continuing to feed the meat grinder on the Eastern Front. But from Lenin's point of view, of course, his country was at war with Germany. Surely he couldn't base his entire victory lap off of conspiring with them. You know, wouldn't that make him first against the wall for treason when people found out? Accepting help from one enemy, the Kaiser, to go and defeat his other enemies, the Tsar and the provisional government, is a kind of Faustian bargain for Lenin, but his problem is that France and Britain won't grant him the transit visas to go via any other route. Although he briefly considers fake papers and using various disguises to travel back to Russia directly through the front lines, including acting out a new identity as a deaf-mute Swedish woman, he's left without realistic alternatives and begins to negotiate with the Germans for a passage up to neutral Scandinavia, asking them to arrange a so-called sealed train. This meant that once they crossed the Swiss border, nobody was allowed to leave or enter. He wanted his train carriage to be granted an extraterritorial status, like a kind of moving embassy that would give him deniability that they had ever formally entered German territory. It would be above the jurisdiction of normal German railway or military employees who would have no right to board or check their papers at any point. And he also demanded that if they were to be escorted by German officials, they weren't even allowed to speak to any of the Russians, and he arranged to bring his Swiss friends with him to use as intermediaries. And that sounds extreme, but he was clearly already thinking in terms of the coming propaganda war. He knew that when accusations of treason were levelled at him, he needed to be able to say, nah, cooperate with Germany? No, we didn't even speak to a single German. We never even set foot on German soil. Funnily enough, that demand actually suited Germany, who were willing to facilitate the trip and send some of their top people along with them, only on the condition that Lenin was not to proselytize, agitate, or try to recruit any Germans in any way. Which just speaks to how dangerous everybody thought this guy was, like leaving him unattended for 5 minutes on a train station platform could lead to the downfall of your entire government or something. Lenin and his wife pack their bags and head from their home on Spiegelgasse down to Zurich's central station. Despite the delicate nature of this operation, they were unable to keep it a secret, and the group of 32 travelling Bolsheviks couldn't even board the first train without causing a scene. Since they were still in neutral territory, their ride up to the border was to take place on a normal scheduled train, and in perhaps the first time I've ever heard of this happening in Swiss territory, its departure was delayed by about 15 minutes. This gives the gathering crowd plenty of time to make their feelings heard. Many Russians were actually living in exile in Switzerland for various reasons at this point, and some cheered Lenin and his team of Bolsheviks onto the train, giving them a kind of hero's farewell, while others who didn't believe in his cause began to accuse them of being spies, pigs and traitors, with some reportedly shouting, "The Kaiser is paying for the journey. They're going to hang you like German spies." From the moment that he boards that first train, those accusations are going to follow Lenin for the rest of his life, particularly when people hear just how bad of a deal he ends up signing for Russia when making peace with Germany. But this departure from Zurich in April 1917 officially sets the wheels in motion on the path to revolution, and their long journey home, which has since become legend in political circles and dramatised again and again, including by both Ben Kingsley and Patrick Stewart, was underway. The Bolsheviks started off in good spirits and were able to marvel at views of waterfalls on their way to Schaffhausen, a small town in the very north of Switzerland. They had wanted to show their lack of reliance on Germany so strongly that they had packed enough food for the entire long and slow journey. But this actually ended up being mostly confiscated at the border, since even though Switzerland was neutral, it could still enforce rules about what quantities of food you were allowed to export. So they hurriedly eat some of their food and are forced to shed the rest before being allowed to pass and head up to Gottmadingen, which is already over the German border, to transfer onto their famous sealed train. So yeah, they would in fact set foot on German soil literally within the first mile, but that's not the last of their conditions that ends up getting broken on this journey. They board their so-called sealed train here at Gottmadingen alongside the German officers who will escort them and get underway, but only go so far as Singen, a further 6 kilometers, which is where the train pulls over and they sleep for the night inside the carriage, sitting under the shadow of the Hauntville castle ruins. But as already noted, the Swiss had confiscated most of their food, so in Singen, the German staff on board volunteered to get off the train and walk into town, coming back with a bundle of sandwiches and beer for everybody. And yeah, by this point, not only have the Russians set foot on German soil, but people have exited and re-entered the train, and the Russians have eaten food provided by Germans, so yeah, ideologically, the whole thing is kind of in tatters at this point. They've bent every single one of their own conditions that were supposed to protect them from accusations of conspiring with the enemy, without even having covered 10 kilometers of their 2,500 kilometer transcontinental mega journey, which to be honest is probably evidence that the sealed status afforded to this train on paper was kind of a token label added for the sake of optics. Although it does have to be said that the Russians do stick to sleeping in the carriage on their presumably fairly uncomfortable seats instead of getting out and sleeping in hotels along the way. They set off from Singen the next morning at 5 AM, and this is where the whole madness really gets underway. They're trying to follow this route as quickly as possible with as few interruptions as possible, but in a way that the modern German tourist probably finds relatable, it doesn't all go to plan. They had decided that the carriage should be divided in two by a symbolic line of chalk drawn on the floor, a kind of border marking the limits of the extraterritorial space afforded to the Russians. They would travel on one side of the line and the Germans would travel on the other. Only their Swiss intermediaries were allowed to cross the line. It all sounds noble and symbolic, but ultimately this chalk line actually made the journey much tougher on the Russians. They vastly outnumbered the Germans and were much more cramped into their half of the carriage, sharing one toilet between the 32 of them. Lenin, who was formulating his future political platform while on the train and wanted to be left to his furious writing and philosophizing, quickly grew tired of his cabin being filled with his comrades' cigarette smoke and forbade them from smoking in the main carriage. He hated the smell and devised a kind of ticket system where Russians were allowed to take turns going and smoking in their bathroom, which probably didn't contribute to the conditions in there. They were pulled by a scheduled train as far as Frankfurt, where they again parked overnight, and it's here that a group of German soldiers actually enter the train, crossing the chalk line and beginning a great discussion with the Russians about when they're going to make peace. So by this point, the whole no talking to Germans rule has also been broken as well, so I'm not sure why they're even bothering with the pretense anymore. But the important thing is that to their relief, the interaction with German soldiers, of course officially their enemies, doesn't turn violent and they're able to continue their push towards Scandinavia. After being reattached to another train in the morning, they realise to their delight that it's a passenger service with a dining car attached, and they arrange for food and drinks to be sent back to them. The mood in the camp is supposed to be excellent around this time, with Lenin later complaining that there was nowhere on board to escape the endless choruses of the Marseillaise being sung by the others. But morale is about to sink as their late departure from Frankfurt begins to make them anxious. They're rolling at a fairly leisurely pace through the central German countryside at this point, aiming for a train ferry that will take their carriage across the sea to neutral Sweden, the fastest route out of German territory. Any unnecessary time spent behind enemy lines just makes them feel less safe and more likely to become the victims of anti-Russian violence. But this ferry only departs once a day, and they look likely to miss it. Their delay gets worse and worse as the journey goes on, and this is where we can see that they were really being supervised by the Germans, who tried everything to expedite them around normal wartime bottlenecks like getting stuck behind troop trains. Their efforts even include an alleged but potentially apocryphal incident where they make the royal train carrying Kaiser Wilhelm's son, the Crown Prince, wait in a siding in Halle for over 2 hours so that he can be overtaken by Lenin, who of course is technically an enemy of the state on his way to murder the cousins of the German royal family. Sorry, spoilers are just leaking out of me at this point. But their haste isn't enough, and the party, already on the 3rd day of their journey, is forced to give up hope of making the ferry, and spend another night parked first in Potsdam and then Stettin, in those days a German city, on their way up to the ferry port on the Baltic Sea, to wait for the next day's sailing. Those familiar with northeastern Germany will know that this last piece is actually an island. They had to cross this strait to even make it up to the ferry port at Sassnitz that they're aiming for, and which ran a train ferry service to Sweden right up until 2024. Today, of course, there's this bridge right here, and travellers can cross by train without even noticing, like I happened to do in this shot from another one of my videos. But back in Lenin's day, they would have had to load their train carriage onto a small ferry to even get onto this island, before unloading again on the other side to travel up towards the port at Sassnitz, where they would spend their final suspenseful moments in enemy territory awaiting their bigger ferry. When that moment finally comes and their entire carriage gets shunted onto the Swedish steamer Queen Victoria, they've officially completed the hard bit, the bit that some of them once thought impossible, making it through Germany unharmed. But they can't exhale too much. Despite having already been on this cramped train, breathing in each other's cigarette smoke in the toilet and bickering about politics for 4 days, in terms of distance covered, they weren't even halfway to St Petersburg. They had over 1,000 kilometers left to cover. During this 4-hour-long sea crossing, which was apparently bumpy and freezing cold, but at least they could finally step off the train and enjoy the amenities on board, it's reported that everyone in the party became seasick, apart from Lenin. Which is just great. I feel like you get little details like that in the founding myth behind every dictator, and you never know if they're true or not. But it's quite a good one, Everybody got seasick, apart from Lenin, apparently. On their arrival in Trelleborg on the south coast of Sweden, they're back on neutral soil and able to give up the whole diplomatic theatre and chalk lines. Their story is also definitely out in the press by this point, as they're welcomed by the local mayor, who sees it that they make it off the ferry and onto the train to Malmö in time. From this point, they're back onto normal passenger trains, which must have been some relief because they had more space, although I'd imagine that Lenin has limited jurisdiction to forbid the normal Swedish civilians travelling with them from smoking in the carriages. In Malmö, also in southern Sweden, the ravenous travellers have a very short walk from the station they arrived at here to a feast just over the road, laid on by some of their communist friends. And they supposedly see off the entire buffet here at Malmö's Savoy Hotel in just 15 minutes before walking back over to board the night train to Stockholm, where they arrive at 9 AM on the 5th day of their journey. Here in 1910 Stockholm, that hopefully you can get some feel for from this archive material, the Russians have plenty of time to eat, shower, meet with their Swedish activist friends, give interviews and have their pictures taken. Lenin, who by this point can smell St Petersburg, also takes the opportunity to buy some new smart clothes in which to give his impending homecoming speech before they all get back on the train and continue north through Swedish Lapland to the border. In those days, despite already having considerable autonomy, Finland was also part of the Russian Empire, so making it across this line here would represent success and see Lenin breathing Russian air for the first time in 17 years. Although their neutral Swiss companion who had travelled all this way with them was denied entry, everybody else was allowed back into Russian Finland, and Lenin and his party boarded a train bound for Helsinki. They transferred here at Riihimäki to travel towards the Finnish-Russian internal border before proceeding to their ultimate goal. 7 whole days since leaving their home in Zurich, they roll into St Petersburg. They had actually pulled it off, and the consequences that are about to flow from this grand arrival are still felt in our world today. Crowds in their thousands are waiting to give Lenin a hero's welcome at Finland Station in St Petersburg, with soldiers forming a guard of honour, women presenting him with flowers, and Lenin getting up on the podium to proclaim his vision for a world socialist revolution. Peace, bread, and land. A platform promising the exhausted Russian people everything that they so badly needed. Lenin's dramatic return is immortalised lovingly in this statue outside Finland Station, and scenes of him receiving flowers are of course iconic by now, but nothing is really that black and white. His most dedicated and adoring followers came out to meet him, sure, but plenty of Russians disagreed with his style and wanted a different type of revolution, including some more moderate voices who even travelled in the train with them and caused arguments all the way. But the Bolshevik hardliners spend the following months campaigning against all these enemies, launching failed coups and organising their new paramilitary until they were able to strike for real. Supposedly using a blank shot fired by the Aurora, whose crew had now mutinied, as the starting gun, their soldiers storm the Winter Palace in St Petersburg in November 1917. The provisional government flee, and Lenin's men seize control of the building, which had also previously been the seat of the Romanovs. Taking their former throne room, of course, has huge symbolic value to this conquest. The Romanovs at this point are also still alive, being kept in an undisclosed location, and we'll return to them soon. The reverence of this moment is enshrined nowhere more emotionally than this painting by Sergei Lukin. Lenin's train route was a long and slowly lit fuse, but it's at this moment right here that the ideological powder keg really goes up and heads begin to roll. With that throne taken, they declare a new era for Russia, centered around workers' councils or Soviets, with Lenin as the new head of state in a one-party socialist government. They go on to attempt to redistribute land and nationalize the banks, while brutally suppressing counter-revolutions via mass executions carried out by their new secret police. Meanwhile, back on the war front, the revolutions have left the army without a central command and in total disarray. Russian soldiers, already ill-equipped at the best of times, are staging mass desertions and no longer keeping the central powers at such an arm's length. Which means that Lenin's Soviets, who already very publicly want out of the war at any cost, hold no cards in the peace talks, and of course end up paying such a heavy price to leave the war. At the negotiations in the Brest-Litovsk fortress that you can see Trotsky's delegation arriving at here in March 1918, they commit to paying the Central Powers reparations worth around 30 billion euros in today's money, and cede all of this land to either recognised independence or to allowing it to become kind of buffer states under the influence of Germany or the Ottomans. This loss of over 1 million square kilometres is hard to overstate in terms of significance. Russia may seem big enough to take the hit, but given that a lot of its huge presence on the map actually looks like this, surrendering all of this actually useful territory in the West was a disaster for them. With one signature, the new Russia loses 1/3 of its farmland, railway network and factories, as well as 75% of its coal reserves and steel plants, in a deal that also takes 50 million people out of their population overnight. Now, the reason that you may not have heard of this treaty is fairly obvious. It didn't end up holding. Germany went on to lose the war anyway 6 months later, and then naturally anything that they'd gained during the war was lost at Versailles. And all of that conveniently lets Russia sweep whatever they'd signed at Brest-Litovsk under the rug. But for those 6 months in the meantime, this peace deal was deeply unpopular. Britain and France, who famously rode into the war alongside the Tsar, were furious that he'd been deposed and that Russia had given up the fight, and many Russians saw the peace as a catastrophic surrender that disgraced the memory of their fallen soldiers, something that would fuel many of Lenin's political opponents in the coming civil wars. Some even interpreted it as proof of those persistent rumours that Lenin was a German spy. I mean, it all seemed too convenient. He'd clearly had to conspire with Germany to even make it back to Russia, and as soon as he was in charge, he'd signed a deal that let Germany win the Eastern Front and take control over vast amounts of land and resources. Dissidents claimed for the rest of his life that Lenin was a Western puppet and that the Bolsheviks were propped up by German bankers who wanted to keep Russia weak on the international stage. The provisional government had even launched an investigation into the possibility of foreign money and interference, until, of course, they were overthrown. Violence was an inherent part of Lenin's ideology, required not just to seize power, but to hold on to it. And with the war over, he was free to squash uprisings and fight civil wars against political enemies within Soviet Russia for the rest of his life. But perhaps the most memorable and disturbing bloodshed of this whole period came on the night of the 16th of July 1918, in the basement of Ipatiev House in Yekaterinburg, where Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children were shot and bayoneted to death by Bolshevik troops. They had been held essentially as prisoners ever since that first coup in the spring, and must have been expecting that a day like this would come. Lenin, of course, knew very well that if you merely exile your opponents, they can always come back to bite you, and so snuffing out the entire bloodline permanently ended any anxiety about a pro-monarchy movement getting in his way. Although it could be argued that executing the Romanov family's doctor, chef, 2 of their servants, and 3 out of 4 of their dogs was a tad unnecessary. Itapiev House no longer exists, having been replaced by another Church of the Spilled Blood in their honour. Its altar stands directly above the spot where the Romanovs were murdered. Because of the secrecy of all their bureaucracy, there's no rock-solid paper trail linking Lenin to the command to kill them, but we do know that he approved of it when he heard that it was done, and, that he was a violent anti-monarchist who was in charge of the people who just murdered the last monarchs. So it doesn't seem like too much of a stretch to imagine that he was behind it. The Bolsheviks soon moved the capital back to Moscow and incorporated other territories into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics at the end of 1922. Lenin himself died a year later, with his work done and a succession battle between Trotsky and Stalin left in his wake. Lenin still lays in state in Red Square to this day, although his body was afforded one final train journey in 1941 when he was evacuated over 2,000 kilometers across to a secret tomb in Tyumen, back into Russian Siberia, to keep it safe in case Nazi troops made it to Moscow. Winston Churchill later lamented Germany's collaboration to get Lenin back into Russia as being similar to pouring a vial of cholera into the water supply of a great city. But from Lenin's point of view, his long and arduous return had finally closed the Romanov chapter once and for all, avenging his brother's death in the process and setting Russia on a new path. Oh, the birds are so loud.